we're going to do kind of a panel event here, and I'll just quickly introduce the panel members who will speak here in just a minute. We have the 119th District Attorney John Best with us, who kind of got all this started, so I'll talk about that in a minute. Also, we have CPA Gayla Thornton with Armstrong, Backus and Company. Thank you, Gayla, for being here. And also Tracy Simmons with Howard College, who works a lot with nonprofits. And thank you, Tracy, for being here, and we'll all speak in just a minute. So it's going to be kind of a panel event, so I definitely want to hear your questions and comments at the appropriate time. This initiative got started when DA John Best called me and wanted to create awareness about the anti-fraud, or about the fraud and embezzlement issue. And so we kind of brainstormed and got a group together called the Initiative. And that was the four of us plus the Chamber of Commerce, Howard College, and other CPA firms, especially the Chilton, Wilcox, and Fortenberry, and also Oliver Rennie Wotech, among others. Also involved the City of San Angelo Development Corporation, COSA-DC was also one of those partners. And there's four groups that kind of funded the initiative, funded the advertising and marketing for the initiative. That was COSA-DC, Armstrong, Backus and Company, Chilton, Wilcox, and Fortenberry, and Oliver Rennie Wotech are the ones that kind of funded the process of marketing. So we want to thank them for their work. And, from the perspective of the SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, we do encounter people that come to us, small businesses, that have encountered fraud of embezzlement. It's often a very devastating, it has a devastating effect on their business. And we work with them to try to help them recover. But oftentimes it is unrecoverable, and their only option is to close the business. So unfortunately, there are occasions when you see a business close and everybody wonders why. Unfortunately, sometimes it's due to embezzlement and fraud. And so the purpose of this is to raise awareness of the issue, to provide resources to help prevent it, and the panel will talk about that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is important to us as the SBDC for for-profit businesses. We like to call it the three-legged stool. And this is not working very well. This, trigger me. Should have tested it out, right? All right. So let's draw a three-legged stool, and nobody laugh at my three-legged stool. But small business needs all three legs to be successful, right? First of all, the technical leg. Most small businesses have this down pat. They're technical experts at what they do, either what they make or what they service. They have this down. They're technical experts. So they know how to make it. Second thing is the marketing. Not only do they know how to make it, they have to know how to sell it. So that's an area that a lot of small business people have a pretty good idea of. Sometimes we help them with that as well as others, people we refer them to. So an area that most small business owners have a good handle of, but we help them with some. Where the issue is, in almost all cases, when a small business is struggling, is in the management leg. And that's the financial, the legal, the HR, that management leg. If that's not taken care of very well, and that leg gets kicked out, what happens to the stool, the three-legged stool? Falls over, doesn't it? This topic falls under that leg, that management leg. And that's why this is so important to us. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to introduce the next panel member. And it doesn't mean I'm done talking. I may interject here and there, as all of us do. But 119th District DA John Best to give his perspective of the whole issue in the program.
Yeah. So thank you guys for being here. I'm assuming that most of you here own or operate small businesses. Would that be fair to say? Do we have any like nonprofit or anything like? Okay, so good. So Dave and I got together on this because I was looking for a way to get the word out to the community that our small businesses, our large businesses, our nonprofits, our taxing entities, anybody that has a board, anybody that has a fiduciary responsibility for managing money, whether it's taxpayer money or your own private money for your business, we've got to be aware of the fact that embezzlement happens, and it happens. I don't want to say when you least suspect it's going to happen, but it happens because people who are put in positions of trust, because they are trusted and beloved, and no one would expect that they would steal money from an organization or a business. They do. It happens. And it's people that you would otherwise care about, respect, love. We're not talking about people with criminal histories. We're not talking about people that you would expect would commit a crime, but it's someone that is presented with an opportunity to take money, somebody that comes across an event in their lives where they rationalize taking the money. And that might be, for example, in my experience, I've got kids in college and I can't afford to pay tuition. I'm going to lose my house if I don't make the mortgage and I can't make the mortgage. I'm going to lose my car. Maybe it's a situation where it may be even something. A relative is sick. My mother is sick and in the hospital, and it's costing a fortune and I can't afford it. Or my child is sick. Or it may be some more less sympathetic motive. I was working. I was able to get overtime until I became a manager, and now I'm a manager and I'm working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, but I'm still working those hours and I should be compensated for that. So, what's it going to hurt if I submit some overtime hours? And if nobody's watching, maybe I'll just do a couple of hours, and then it turns into 4 hours or 6 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours, and that adds up to thousands of dollars over time if nobody's watching. And so when I came to Dave, the thought was, what can we do to just talk about? Let's have this conversation. We need boards for nonprofits need to have this conversation. Businesses, small businesses, your employees maybe stealing lottery tickets, or stealing money out of the cash, or what, let's have the conversation about how we can try and prevent these crimes from happening before they ever get, to my office. Or to the county attorney's office. What can we do to help small businesses and organizations protect themselves from this kind of thing? Because like Dave said, the last thing you want to do as a nonprofit is tell the community that supports you that you weren't watching closely enough and somebody took advantage of the situation and embezzled some money. So if the checks and balances are in place, and the same thing for a big business, or a small business, if the checks and balances are in place, it doesn't even have to be a significant structure that you have in place. Just checks and balances that make sure that someone can't take advantage of you or won't take advantage of you, or maybe there's just an impediment to them taking advantage of you, and that helps eliminate the opportunity for them to do that. So that's kind of what this is all about, and why we started the initiative, and hopefully it'll help keep this kind of crime from happening going forward. That's about all I had.
Okay, Well, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how prevalent fraud is in the world. And then we're going to talk about some things you can do to help prevent fraud in your organization and why that's important. So I believe everyone has a packet in front of them that has a bunch of statistics and slides, because you might not be able to see what's on the wall. But I want to refer to a report that's issued annually called the Report to the Nation. So a lot of the facts that you're going to see come straight from that 2018 report that was issued, and it's put out by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And what this does is it puts out alarming stats as to how prevalent this is, how costly this can be, how many organizations it impacts. Fraud is a real issue. So the fact that this is being talked about in San Angelo is a good step in the right direction. So just to throw some of those stats at you, this 2018 study was based on 2,690 real cases of occupational fraud in 125 countries, 23 different industries. Total losses for this study of the 2,690 cases totaled over $7 billion. Fraud is expensive. The median loss per case was $130,000, but what they find is smaller organizations, that loss can be double. It can be closer to $200,000 for small organizations. It could be detrimental to your organization. And so the most common scheme found in the study was asset misappropriation, which is theft of cash, theft of inventory, theft of any asset that is of value to the company. Financial statement fraud made up 10% of the common schemes. So asset misappropriation is probably the most common, and it's the one that you could probably, as an organization, put controls in to prevent the best. As far as detection, there's kind of a misconception that if you have a CPA involved in your books, if you have an audit, these things can't happen. Well, it depends. So CPAs get in and they review your books, but unless they have access to the approvals and to all of the behind-the-scene type organization, they may or may not catch it. Financial statement audits are where you go in and you're just determining if the books are in accordance with your applicable reporting framework. We don't audit for fraud. We consider fraud, but that's not what we're doing, is we're not going in and trying to find all the frauds that occur. And one of the things I hear most common is when you hear about a fraud in the news, people are always like, well, why didn't the auditors find that? Because that's not the auditor's job. It's management's job to put controls in place to prevent these things so that they don't make the news. Moving on, occupational fraud can cost a lot, as we talked about. It costs accounting fees, legal fees, PR nightmare. It's expensive to the company, not to mention the amount of money that was actually stolen from the organization. So this is a lot of costs we're talking about. Fraud, as I mentioned, in small businesses is double for organizations that have less than 100 employees than those that have more than. It's $200,000 median loss compared to $100,000. And what I find most interesting about this slide is that frauds caused by a lack of internal control make up 42% of frauds in small businesses. That's the thing you can impact. That's the thing you can change. There's a slide that talks about losses by industry. So this affects any industry out there. Nonprofits, governments, for-profits, construction companies, banks. It happens everywhere. So this slide's just interesting to show you all the different industries and how much they lost. Anti-fraud controls are the best thing you can do. So as an owner, as a governing board of a nonprofit, as management, the best thing you can do is establish good internal controls or checks and balances on the front end to protect your organization, to protect your employees. You want to be able to say, if someone comes to you and says, I think we have a problem, you want controls to be in place where there's no way this employee is responsible for that, because there were people double checking what they did. There was oversight. And the reason why fraud is so prevalent in the smaller organizations is because they don't have as many employees to segregate duties among. And so you can't spread those internal controls out. There aren't as many people to double check. And so that's when the owners and management have to get in, and they have to sign the checks, they have to approve everything, they have to review the bank statement. And don't just put all of that on one person. And that's how you can really make a difference. So, in summary, internal controls are the most important thing that you can establish. If you are unsure as to what those controls should be, you can contact any of the CPA firms that are mentioned or sponsors of the initiative, and you can sit down on the front end and you can really think about who's responsible for what, who's checking what. Because if you do that on the front end, the chances that there's going to be a problem that the CPA has to get involved on the back end are a lot less. It's the absolute best thing you can do. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy. Oh, just a moment.
I can hold it. I talk rather fast. For those that haven't met me before, and I see some of my nonprofit organizations that are out here, my name's Tracy Simmons. I'm at Howard College. I am your nonprofit training coordinator. I've been funded with the Area Foundation and Health Foundation over the course of 3 years to do training specifically to build the toolkits of our nonprofits here in the community to better serve the clients. They brought me in on that anti-fraud, anti-embezzlement task force to work with building the training entity. Because, of course, once we launched this initiative and try to get the word out, we're like, okay, now what do we do? So I've been fortunate enough to get some great contacts that are, overall, I've looked at their curricular vitae. Between the two of them, they have 98 years of experience in fraud and embezzlement, so they're going to bring a wealth of knowledge to the community. We have gone ahead and solidified the guest speakers who are coming for free. They believe that strongly in educating the community on the initiative. So we have Dr. Richard Weinberger, who's coming. He is world-renowned, small business development. Actually, let me make sure I do this. He's the Association of Accredited Small Business Consultants. So he's coming from the Austin area. And then we have Sandy Sullivan. And Sandy is the Senior VP of Frost Bank and Fraud Management. She's been with the bank for 48 years. Yeah, she likes to tell everybody she started when she was in utero. So, but between the two of them, they're gonna bring a great bit of information to the community. Sandy's going to speak in the morning, and Dr. Weinberger is going to speak in the afternoon. And sandwiched in the middle of June 2nd is going to be a Q&A panel. So while you're enjoying lunch, we're going to have our three CPA firms that are sponsors of this. They're going to be on the panel, as well as Detective Colby from the SAPD. He's one of the two detectives, Chief, tell me if I'm wrong, who works specifically with financial fraud cases here in the community. I may have misspoken as that. I know he works with the financial side of things, but he works with our fraud cases. And I'm going to have hopefully District Attorney Best will be there. He's got a full schedule, and I want to be respectful of his schedule. If he's not going to be able to be available, then I'm sure he's going to make sure he's got a good representation there at the table to answer any questions. But the key to the day is to make sure that our nonprofits, as well as our for-profit, small business and big business, have a day of education on how to identify, what to look for. We'll have great representation in the crowd for, the faces in the community, as far as, who do you turn to if you believe that your organization or your business has been a victim of some type of fraud. You're going to have local faces that are the experts in the community that can help you on your what's next steps. But education is key, and I'm thankful to be a part of it. Dr. Weinberger staying overnight. He's going to repeat his session the next morning for those that can't commit to a full day. I want to be respectful of that. So the full day is June 2nd. June 3rd is just the half day of just Dr. Weinberger's presentation. If y'all can't commit to a full day, we want to make sure that we can get everybody there. So yes, and more details to come. We're going to launch this initiative the initiative itself is, but the training aspect of it all, we're going to make sure that we get the word out to everybody, whether it be through the SBDC, through Angelo State, through Howard College, through the Chamber. We're going to make sure that the word is out. But y'all are the first to hear today that the training is on June 2nd and June 3rd. So thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I wanted to add just a few things if I could and encourage the other panel members to do as well. On my private sector experience operating businesses, I found that communication is a key, and also training is communicating to the employees that there are methods in place to prevent embezzlement and fraud. Make sure they know that from day one. It protects them as well. I always made sure that one person was not in a position where they did everything, where they could be suspected of fraud or embezzlement, that there's always a double check, and that's kind of the theme. Also, whenever we thought of something might be happening, we never accused anybody till it was fully vetted or fully looked at. So it's real important that you don't accuse somebody of this until you really know that it's true. And you can seek legal CPA advice or human resource advice if you need to make sure you're doing well on that. One of the questions, though, one of the things that I always thought, I was always kind of aware, trying to be aware when I heard something or something popped up, a red flag that didn't seem quite right. Instead of just pushing it aside or blowing it off, I'd always try to look into it, because as you know, when you're in business, you develop a sixth sense, or when you're operating a nonprofit, which is somewhat of a business, you just don't do it for profit. You develop that sixth sense, like, okay, I heard this or saw this, something's not quite right. Should I just move on or should I look into it? Well, it's always good to listen to that sixth sense and look into it. May not be anything, but it may lead to something. And it's not that you walk around every day, all day long, being suspicious, and we all know that's not the way to operate an organization, right? But you got to develop that skill. I think I read somewhere where a vast majority of ways that embezzlement or fraud are caught is through tips. And tips can come in many ways. Tips can come from employee exit reviews or anonymous tips that you receive, or things that pop up that kind of are tips that you should look into. I remember operating a business when I first got to this operation. In the first week, I got a call from the answering service saying, we got this $16,000 check here. We're not sure what to do with it or why we have it. And I said, okay, that's interesting, and let me get back to you. And then I got back to them, being more concerned. I said, well, somebody just picked it up, so I guess we're okay. And I said, well, can you, luckily they made a copy of it, and back then they faxed it over. This is many years ago. They faxed over a copy, and one of the employees recognized the signature. It was the former manager of the operation, using a different name. And so obviously, long story short, we dug into it, and that was embezzling through creating a fictitious vendor and initiating a PO where that check was cut, and it was sent to this answering service, not sure why, but it ended up that being caught. So it's just a matter of hearing something as a red flag that popped up, instead of, they're crazy and they know what they're talking about, just looked into it. And so that's one way. All of us in this room, I'm sure, have nonprofit experience. Like most of you, I've been on boards before and been a president of a board. And I know that for board members, as I understand it, if we're trying to think of the word, not advisory boards, but what kind of board? Not advisory, but pardon? Yeah, board of directors, but our duty is not just advise, I'm trying to think of a word. Fiduciary, yeah. we have a fiduciary duty. We are the checks and balance of the organization, so to speak. So our job is not to take our duties too lightly, and I was guilty of it too. Let's meet and have lunch, talk to everybody, and wait till next month, right? And sometimes we would just gloss over financials or things like that. So obviously, we all trust everybody. We want to trust everybody, and we should, but we ought to make sure we take our responsibility as board members seriously. And I think the executive directors would prefer that, if I'm not mistaken. They would like active board members to be looking into things and questioning things so that they, that's how a good organization keeps going. So is that fair to say? Is that okay? And so the nonprofit world, as board members, we need to take our responsibility seriously as well. So what about the rest of you? What other things would you want to interject before we get to questions?
I'll just tell you real quick, I think it surprises folks, since I work so closely with the nonprofit community, that we have over 821 registered nonprofits in San Angelo alone. I've been quoted to say 400 plus in the Concho Valley. So, I mean, there's a lot. Every church, scouts, every organization that you can think of has some sort of a connection to a nonprofit. And, 100,000 people, we cycle through a lot of the same board members through a lot of those nonprofits. So, and a lot of the smaller mom and pop nonprofits don't have a designated HR person, let alone a CFO. So there's a lot of opportunity for, slips. I want to say slips. I don't want to point the finger and say where somebody's going to blatantly, embezzle from them. But if you serve as a board member, like Dave said, you need to take your responsibilities seriously. It's great to have lunch and come and chit chat, but it's very important to do those checks and balances and double check. That is our motto for this initiative: double check. It's critical. We all have seen very worthwhile organizations in the community fold as a result of either blatant fraud and embezzlement, or just, people just were very trusting and didn't know that was happening right under their noses. So serve and take those responsibilities seriously. It only strengthens our community if in you doing so.
And sometimes those conversations can be difficult to start. And so, again, part of this initiative, in my mind, is to give people reason to have those conversations. Hey, fellow board members, what are we doing to make sure that our organization, is taken care of going into today and into the future? How are we going to make sure that something like this doesn't happen to us? What measures can we put in place to make sure something bad doesn't happen? Because when you go into a board meeting, for example, a typical board meeting, your treasurer might hand out a sheet of paper that's got, here's our assets and here's our liabilities, and we paid this much for this thing and this much for this thing, and it's real high level, and nobody's. It doesn't mean your treasurer's doing anything wrong, but nobody's looking any deeper than that. Where you're going to find the fraud is if you look at a credit card statement, for example, and you see the $100 gift cards to Apple that were purchased at Lowe's, or you see you'll see it. If you look, and if there's a problem, you will see it immediately. But no one looks at that. And if there's not a credit card, which credit cards are the root of many problems in small businesses, in all the organizations. But if you look at bank statements, you might also see checks written to, cash, or to a person, or, something that looks problematic. And that's what a targeted forensic audit might look at. A lot of businesses, we were talking about this earlier, you think about, well, should we have an auditor come in? Well, you're thinking that's expensive. That's going to cost a lot of money. And especially for nonprofits, they might not like the idea of doing that, especially smaller nonprofits, small businesses. But what we've talked to some of our CPAs about is maybe developing a targeted audit type situation that would cost less money, where they could look at some specific areas like maybe credit card statements or checking accounts or things like that, to see if anything looks unusual. But backing up a little bit, again, the point is to have the conversation. I hope that nonprofits and boards and businesses and just everyone in our community that might be susceptible to embezzlement will start talking about it in a way that's not accusatory, that's protective of the businesses and nonprofits.
I have a comment along the lines you were talking about having your, I'm sorry, my name is Dee Bless and I'm with West Texas Counseling and Guidance. I worked years and years and years as a bookkeeper in CPA firms around town, and some of the things that we would see, you were talking about the board looking at the bank statements and things. Well, now we get images from the bank. We only get images of the front of the check. So as a board member, be sure and look at those images first of all. But back then, we got the checks back, so we could see front and back. And I had a client that she delayed on getting me her goods, and I finally, several months, not several months, but a month or so, 2-3 months go by, and I'm telling the CPA, I'm telling the owner, finally get her books, and every few check stubs were for Walmart. I was like, why are you getting so many office supplies and cleaning supplies from Walmart? Well, when you finally get to looking at the checks, the check that said Walmart at first, she had marked out, put her name and rubber stamped her boss's name, and he had no clue. It wasn't a non-profit, obviously, but I think with us just getting the front of the images back, it may be hard too for a board member, as they're glancing over that stuff, to see that, there wasn't anything funny going on there. In the case of, like with our firm, we have to have 2 signatures on every single check. And before anybody signs that check, it has to have backup attached to the check so that they can see exactly what they're signing for. So by the time it gets to the bank, hopefully, the board member looks at that. There's nothing funny going on there. But I think sometimes as we progress in our technology, we might take away a layer as well that we might miss.
When we were talking about that also with like QuickBooks, and that's a mystery to me, and it's a mystery to a lot of business owners. And you find someone that, I know QuickBooks. Oh, be careful. You've got to spread out, like Dave was saying, spread out that responsibility to more than one person, because if one person gets hold of your QuickBooks and they know how to manipulate things, you'll have a real hard time figuring out. You can't. If they decide to take advantage of you, have a real hard time trying to figure out what they've done, how much they've done to you, and sorting it all out. So,
I think Gayla could probably attest to this as well. At the Small Business Development Center, we work with a lot of business clients, not only startups, but a lot of existing businesses, and the owners are all busy. They just want to make it and sell it. Not all of them, but that's their primary job, right? Nothing happens till they sell something, and so they're focused on that, and they wish the third leg they wish somebody else would take care of because they don't like it, they don't understand it, and wish it would go away, because they want to focus on real important things. But not all. You'll run across those business owners that got a handle on everything, but it's not typical. So you got to make an effort to look into things, and I know there's no time. You're so busy, you're working yourself to death anyway, but you got to take a moment and say, I'm going to go into show me how to go into QuickBooks and look at the vendor list. Run the general ledger detail for me. Let me take a look at that, and you can do it without accusatory way, and just know that it's your job. You're the owner. You have a right to look at anything you wish. And would that be fair to say, or do you want to add?
No, I think that's completely fair to say. And I would never let time or efficiency deter you from following your controls, asking the questions. I know it's just easier to just show up. I know it's easier to just sign a check if you're a board member and you are in charge of that. But always ask the right questions. Always look at the supporting detail. If something doesn't look right, ask the bookkeeper about it. Ask the person who's recording that transaction, because if you don't feel right about it, it's probably a problem, or it could be a problem, or it's an opportunity to put a control in place to prevent it from being a problem in the future. And you know, a lot of boards tell me when I recommend having dual signatures on checks, well, it's so hard to track down a board member. Well, now there's online apps that you can use to approve them online, that the board member never has to leave their computer. They can just look at the invoice on the screen, they can approve that transaction, and it's just like signing a check. So think about ways to make the job easier, keep your controls in place, and prevent.
Well, if there's no other comments from the panel, at this time we can go into questions from the audience. And these three here will take all the tough questions. But how about questions or comments?
Easier way to, I don't know exactly how to ask this question, but I just changed the way our financials were being presented to the board, hopefully making it easier. But is there a standard, well, I don't know if standard's a good word, but is there a way that we should be, as a nonprofit, be presenting financials to board members? I mean, is there, do you know what I'm asking? Good, okay.
I do. So internally, you need to understand what the board members are looking for. If you're very budget driven, the budget to actual is probably one of the most important statements that you could provide, because you understand if the revenue's on track. If not, you might need to adjust your spending. If it comes time for an audit, though, there's adjustments you need to make to meet the standard of generally accepted accounting principles or cash basis. But knowing the user of your financial statements and what is most important to them, and it's different for every organization, that'll help drive which reports that you provide.
So, I mean, what I said might have not made a whole lot of sense, because as a board member, I don't want to go into a board meeting every month and look at credit card statements, you know, or bank statements. But I guess the caveat to that would be that there should be some kind of check and balance in place where a board member or more than one board member at some point, maybe quarterly, I don't know what the generally accepted accounting standard would be, but would get with maybe the treasurer and say, let's talk about, or maybe the executive director, let's talk about, or look at the statements and just see what all we're doing and where the money's going, and just as a check and balance. Maybe something like that. Again, I don't know, that would probably be a better CPA approach, but just some way, someone that's not just brushing over, you know, the finances every month. Because then we get it 2 or 3 years later and it's someone took us for $50,000 that we never would have thought, well, or $200,000 or $1 million, you know. I mean, the numbers are astronomical, and it's not just other places, it's here. I mean, that's the, you know, it's kind of like this says, it's happening right here in West Texas, and it is hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's what I'm seeing. And I am not going to guarantee you, but I feel very strongly that it's the tip of the iceberg, that there's a lot more out there that we're not even aware of yet that's happening. And I don't want to see our nonprofits get hurt that way. You know, we were talking about this earlier, you know, we have such a generous giving community, you know, for causes that deserve to be helped and promoted. And to have someone come in and cut the legs out from under that organization is angering, and it's frustrating, and it's sad, but it happens. And so we want, you know, I want to try and get people to be aware. You know, I think we all do. You know, be aware and let's try and identify that. You know, keep it from happening and identify if it is happening and stop it.
So tell us so I have fraud in this organization. As an example, because I'm with you. What do I, as a board member, what's the appropriate procedures? Got documented, obviously. And at what point does it become an issue where I turn it over either to the police department, to you? What's the appropriate steps?
I think that's a good question. And I think once you identify the problem, I think that you have to call law enforcement. Well, you don't have to, but the next step would be to call law enforcement if that's what your board thinks needs to happen, and report it. What's going to probably happen is you're going to end up having to get a forensic auditor involved to get in and do an accounting of where the money went, what happened, who did what was inappropriate and what was not, what was authorized, what wasn't authorized, how much we're talking about. That will determine what level of offense it might be. If it's over $2,500, we're talking about a felony, and the range goes up higher and higher depending on how much was stolen.
So at what point, and I don't say this jokingly, is fraud taken seriously by law enforcement?
I think Chief Carter could speak to this, but I think fraud is going to be taken seriously anytime it's reported to law enforcement, just like any other crime. Crime is crime. We take it seriously. I know our law enforcement takes it seriously. They're going to investigate it, but I would imagine, if a case goes to them and it comes to me and there hadn't been a forensic audit, I don't necessarily know that I can do my job because I'm not an auditor. I can't go into the books and figure out what was misappropriated. Someone's got to do that for me and bring it to me and say, here's what's been misappropriated, here's how we know it, here's how we know who did it, and then I can take that to court and prosecute it. But I think law enforcement is going to...
Yeah, I'm not being funny. Any amount? Okay. Yeah, a serious question because there's different levels of theft, obviously.
And of course, I think we touched on this earlier. The other conundrum, I guess is the best word for it, is for nonprofits, when you realize that the checks and balances haven't been in place, and you've got to now, is this going to be publicized or is this not going to be publicized? And what are we going to do about it? How are we going to deal with it? Because if we go out in the community and say, here's what happened because we weren't watching the hen house, that's not going to, that may not be very well received by the people that have given hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to your organization. So you want those checks and balances in place to avoid that kind of situation. And there are times where those organizations don't want to prosecute, and they may not even bring it to law enforcement. I think there are probably some duties that they have to report those kind of things, but sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And even if they do, they may not want to pursue it very aggressively because of the notoriety that comes along with that kind of publicity.
What kind of penalties would it be for, you said that the board has financial responsibility of looking over the books, and if they don't and they ignore it and they find it, what kind of liability would be left on the board?
That's probably a good CPA question, and I think some boards, especially bigger boards, have insurance.
Yeah, directors and officers insurance. I highly recommend that. Yeah, and it depends on where the money came from, because if it's coming from like a granting agency, you would owe that money back. If it's a donor, it's almost just a PR relationship issue. But in some instances, the money has to be returned, and the board would be on the hook for that if the organization didn't have the cash to pay it back.
Okay. And of course, I guess they could be in legal against
Right.
with the law.
Right. So if your nonprofit doesn't have D&O insurance, it's a good thing to have.
There might be civil liability. I don't know that criminal liability would come up unless there was evidence that someone on the board was complicit in, letting it happen, or making it happen than letting it happen.
Good questions. What other questions do we have, or comments?
Sure, I've got a question. So for smaller nonprofits, typically have one bookkeeper, one person who's in charge of all the books. And that person can be in charge of both deposits and withdrawals. So what kind of financial policies and procedures might be helpful to make sure that person can't take funds from the organization?
Don't allow the one person to open the mail, write the check, sign the check, reconcile the bank statement, receive the bank statement. And if there's only 1 or 2 employees in that organization, then it's incumbent on the board to step in and fill in on those missing roles. And that's when board signatures are important, board review of the bank statement, approval, review of the general ledger. Anytime you only have a couple of employees, the board has to get involved.
Along those lines, just to further mention what Gayla was discussing is, you can develop an internal checklist of, doing a internal review, cursory review of your bank statement, your checks, your invoices, your quotes for your purchases, compared to who in your organization is signing what, and just having a sort of like a double signature that kind of keeps everybody. If you can't separate everyone, at least someone could be checking the other one, and then that could be something that the board could always look at it.
And there are always going to be situations where someone is motivated to steal. They're a thief and they're going to steal and they're going to find a way to do it. And once they figure out your systems and weaknesses in your systems, they're going to exploit them. They may get phony signature stamps, for example. There are ways to get around systems, but you just want to have, at a minimum, something to help eliminate that opportunity to be able to take advantage. And by and large, I believe that those people are few and far between, the people that are the thieves. It's people that I keep trying to remember that word and I have so much trouble with it. The people the rationalization, that's the key to it. People that are otherwise law-abiding, trustworthy people in our community that you otherwise love and respect, that have something happen in their lives that allow them, it may not even be something that happened, they rationalize stealing. They come up with an excuse for why it's okay for them to do it. And it may be a really good reason, they may have a great reason for it. Like I said, my son is in the hospital, he's got leukemia, I've got to get treatment for him, and I will do whatever I have to do to give him that treatment, but I can't afford it. And so another thing we talked about is be aware of what's going on with your employees. If your employee shows up driving a Porsche and they didn't, or they have, this sounds a little sinister, I don't like it, but if your employee has a sick family member or something and they are struggling, just be aware, and of course I'd be empathetic and be wanting to help in any way I could, and you probably will be helping in any way you could. But just be aware of your surroundings and your business and your employees and what's going on with everybody as much as you can, because those can create, rationalizations for doing things that people ordinarily wouldn't do, if that makes sense.
And a lot of times these occurrences happen that people say, oh, you know what, I'm going to pay that back. I need this to pay my child's medical bill, but I'm going to pay that back. But then something else happens and they don't. And then they realize, oh, I got away with that. You know what? This is happening. I need a little bit more. And then they get away with that, and I need a little bit more. And so it just continues to grow, and that's when it becomes a problem. And to piggyback on the question that you were asking as far as reporting it, I always encourage people to report it, because if they did it for you and you let them get away with it, the chances are of them going somewhere else and doing it, they're going to get away with that too. And that's very common with...
Did we mention the fraud triangle? I know we mentioned parts of it, right?
Rationalization's our favorite.
Okay, yeah.
Opportunity is important too.
Yeah.
So,
And pressure. Opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. Anytime you have those three components of the fraud triangle, you've got the ingredients for someone to commit fraud. The one that you can control is the opportunity. By putting those internal controls in place, you can prevent them from having the opportunity to take that asset from you.
I think a good measure that some companies can use is like when you insist that some employees utilize their vacation time, that's a good measure that you can, somebody steps in and does the job, you've got your backup person that does the job. That's when you can see some of these things that are happening. That's a good means for the company to target if somebody's trying to commit fraud or embezzlement. So I think it's a good tool that small companies insist that their employees take vacation, if not for any reason, them to get some time away from and get some rest, but for that main purpose that there may be some embezzlement going on, and once the employee steps away and somebody else comes in to do their job, that's when they can see that these things are happening, because something draws off the red flag, and that gives us the opportunity to see that something's not right, and then we can catch these things happening. So I encourage people to always insist that their staff take vacation for that very reason, to catch those kind of things that happen.
You're absolutely right, but a lot of times companies look at that employee that never takes a vacation as one of the most dedicated employees because they're willing to work every day of the year. Yeah, right, exactly. That was a very good point.
All right. If there's none other questions, if you can click the resources there, Gayla, thank you. There are resources that you can use, obviously your CPA firms. And these are the 3 CPA firms that help fund this initiative. At Small Business Development Center, we work with for-profit businesses, and we'd be happy to discuss with you your situation at no cost or very confidential. And we'll do our best to help you. And we know at the point that you need to seek CPA or legal advice as well. We have a web page here. It's the angelo.edu/anti-fraud webpage. It has a lot of resources. Is there another slide? Nope. Okay. But anyway, just go to that, and that has links to various publications and things like that, like this embezzlement study, where some of our stats came from, and other resources that we'll continue to add to it to help you have a resource there for that. This initiative will continue. We look for great things from the event in June that Tracy's putting together, and that should be a great event to help you as well. Also on the table outside, you have some of the small flyers here, the double check flyers, and also some posters. So feel free to take those with you if you have a use for those to help us create the awareness. Yeah. Anything else?
Just know the training on June 2nd and 3rd is open to the entire community. Even though I am a nonprofit training coordinator, this is put on, as a result of the task force. So it's for profit and not for profit.
And where will it be held again?
It's going to be out at Howard College in the West Texas Training Center. If any of you ever done any of the trainings out there, it's a little bit hectic to get out there. Actually, I think it's easier now that we've got the cut across. But it is a room that can hold up to 200 people, and we're wanting as many people as possible to take advantage of the training. So there will be a small fee and a registration form. I don't want that to surprise anybody. It's a $30 fee. It's because it's an all-day workshop. The facilitators were gracious enough to donate their time, but they are staying in a hotel, and they do have handouts and travel expenses to get up here. So it's going to be $30 a person, catered lunch. Market Street will have Market Street cater the lunch, and just come ready to learn. It's going to be a lot of content, a lot of content.
May we say thank you?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Thank you to the panel, also Chief Carter and his assistant chiefs. Thank you for being here, and all of you. If you would, fill out your blue evaluation form, please.